Okay, all right. Sorry about that technical difficulty. So welcome to Conversations on Species Credits. My name is Doug Bruggeman. I'm the founder of Ecological Services and Markets, and I've been hosting a webinar here for over a year to provide a platform to discuss opportunities and barriers in species crediting, including conservation banking. So we had an opening in the schedule, so I thought I'd jump in myself and provide a topic that I've been thinking about for a while. And I want to thank Donna Collier, Craig Denisoff, Greg DeYoung, and Sarah Johnson, the steering committee, for helping to keep this going and advertising the webinar. So we are going to have a facilitated discussion at the National Mitigation and Ecosystem Banking Conference in Boise, Idaho next week. Wednesday around lunch during the facilitated discussions. You can find us there and hopefully show up and provide some feedback and participate in the discussion. So today I want to talk about managing uncertainty in species credit markets and talk about lessons from recovery plans and species status assessments. And just a note that this is my website, esmarkets.com, although it recently, the website went down for some unknown reason. I've been working to get it set up again. So, okay, with that, I want to start by getting into some definitions. And hopefully after I'm done speaking, that there'll be opportunity for discussion and you could post questions in the chat box. And I would ask you that you post those questions so everyone can see them. So post to everyone. All right, so uncertainty discusses cases in which, outcomes or probabilities of occurrence are unknown, right? It's kind of like, it's basically our area of ignorance, right? So we often don't know how these species are dispersing across landscapes. In contrast, though, risk discuss cases where there are potential outcomes and their likelihood of occurrence is known. So risk is things like risk of hurricanes and risk of droughts, things that we can calculate with data. So in the species banking and crediting community, you often see presentations and discussions about avoiding or removing uncertainty. And so in this presentation, I'm going to ask us to consider embracing uncertainty might be good. So, we work in incredibly complex landscapes with a lot of heterogeneity and under climate change. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And so I think that embracing uncertainty could be good for species and other landowners. So there's growing interest in uncertainty for sure, and I'm very grateful that you guys logged on to the presentation today. But in general, I'll highlight that not a lot of investors or bankers have asked me to embrace uncertainty. And I recently heard this quote by Henry Ford, and Henry Ford said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for faster horses. So sometimes providing opportunities to disrupt markets could be good. And given the uncertainties ahead of us, I think we should consider it. And so this is Henry Ford in the first car that he ever built and sold. And as he got older, he found that car and bought it back. And it's kind of cool to see it has bike tires on that car. Okay, so there we go. So global climate change is happening. It's hard to kind of wrap our heads around oftentimes. And I found this animation from NASA of carbon monoxide being produced by the burning of the Amazon rainforest in 2019. And it really helps you get a sense of the magnitude of global environmental change. And so, as many of you know, the Amazon rainforest is now a net emitter of carbon rather than being a net sink. So the climate's changing. So this is from the IPCC 2021 Physical Basis for Climate Change report, highlighting the different the shared socioeconomic pathways or policy options that we might embark on. And the goal of the Paris climate deal was to get to SSP 2.6, to keep temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. However, our current nationally determined contributions are likely to get us to below 3 degrees C if we're lucky with a lot of effort. So, and what's interesting though is that what we can expect in the near term over the next 20 years. So over the next 20 years, we can expect temperature increases regardless of our policy choices. So we can expect increases in the frequency of droughts, floods, wildfires, and extreme heats. And the folks at Defenders of Wildlife, and hopefully some folks from Defenders are logged on, did a nice study published in Nature Climate Change, and they evaluated 459 management plans for listed species and found that 99.8% of those species are somewhat sensitive to climate change. But the plans only considered climate change to be a threat in only 64% of the plans. And of those 459, only 18% of the plans included management actions to account for climate change. So a very useful study, but I think it highlights just how overwhelming climate change is, and we're struggling to find a way to move forward to deal with it. So we really need repeatable and transparent ways to manage uncertainty, given the effects of habitat fragmentation and climate change. And this cartoon just highlights that, ignoring uncertainty and making decisions anyway can have negative consequences. You'd hate to be the person in the car behind that hazardous truck. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the old policy. I know we're all waiting for updated policy. We're waiting for updated policy to come down from Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior. I think from what I've heard that the updated policy will be strongly inspired by the 2016 policies. So I want to go through, just sketch those policies for us and then go into how they could relate to recovery plans and species status assessments. So the 2016 ESA mitigation policy encourages strategic planning at the landscape scale and requires the mitigation hierarchy, right, to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts, and requires that we achieve net gains in terms of number of individuals or habitat quality. And they recommend dealing with uncertainty by creating larger connected banks, providing predictable rules for trading, and providing advanced mitigation, and highlighting the need for financial assurances. And further, they state that the metrics for take and credit must be equivalent, that they must account for duration of impact, temporal loss, management of risk at the mitigation site as well, and then also just note the uncertainty present. And the policy also highlights that we might need to adjust metrics over time through monitoring and adaptive management. And that makes a lot of sense, but I don't know of any examples within a bank in which they're adjusting their metrics. I'm sure bankers are adjusting metrics across different banks, but maybe somebody has some feedback there. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service mitigation policy was motivated to really highlight more concerns about habitat fragmentation and climate change, and provided more detail on a landscape scale approach in terms of using existing landscape level plans, and to incorporate a relevant spatial scale to consider climate change. And that's critical, but boy, that's a hard thing to do, I think. And to design mitigation to prevent fragmented landscapes and to restore core habitats and connectivity. And they recognize that mitigation will often have to be implemented in landscapes with a lot of uncertainty. And yet the goal of achieving net gains remains. So the work ahead of us is difficult. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will continually seek better information in areas of greatest uncertainty. And they really emphasize advanced mitigation that avoids and accounts for future threats as being critical. And they create the opportunity to use research and education as a form of compensatory mitigation, but it's typically not allowed. The exception being when habitat loss is not the major threat. My concern here, though, is that this is kind of the catch-22 because it takes some research to figure out how important habitat loss is relative to fragmentation and climate change, for example. And the other exceptions are when research and education are expected to offset impacts, when the bank proponent commits to using research results to mitigate impacts, and no other reasonable options for mitigation are available. So I think it provides some room for applying techniques to reduce uncertainty that could be explored. So credits represent conservation value in perpetuity. But crediting shouldn't instill uncertainty in perpetuity, right? Yet bankers have limited spatial scale of influence. They're still required to incorporate climate change and fragmentation effects into their decision making. So reducing uncertainty is certainly an important part of recovery. And what role might bankers or credit markets help? So species status assessments and recovery plans, they both endeavor to provide repeatable and transparent ways to manage uncertainty at broad spatial scales. So in my work in developing landscape scale crediting systems for species, I've done so for 3 species, and for one species, there's a recovery plan that I used heavily when designing the crediting, and the other species, there was an SSA available, species status assessment, and that was incredibly helpful. And then for the third species, it was a candidate species, and I basically went through the process of developing an SSA as I designed the credit market. So a species status assessment is a systematic analysis of current and future responses of species to stressors and management efforts. The idea is to analyze all available scientific information to estimate current conditions and forecast future conditions, and incorporate, and ideally, it's a scientific report independent of policy. And ideally, it's initiated with a listing decision, and it's used to determine the legal status. And the SSA informs recovery planning, consultations, and permitting. So hopefully people seeking credits are familiar with it. So it's based on the 3 R's: representation, resiliency, and redundancy. So representation being the idea that we need to conserve something of everything, both ecological diversity and genetic diversity, to protect adaptive capacity for the population and the species. The resiliency, the idea is to protect population components that will help the population bounce back after stress. And redundancy then is you want to spread risk among multiple populations. As you probably know, spatially structured populations spread risk across the landscape and help the species to persist. All right, so there are 3 major topic areas in an SSA. First is the ecology of the species, describing the life history, to identify pieces of the species range with significant genetic or life history variation, to describe current conditions of habitat, demographics, the spatial distribution, population trends, and to describe current hypotheses about stressors. And then they also go into future conditions, expected responses to a range of future scenarios and environmental conditions that we might expect in the future, including management efforts in the future. So a nice summary by some USGS scientists led by Smith in the Journal of Wildlife Management. They highlight that constructing and evaluating models is a critical component of an SSA, and that uncertainty and low quality data do not make modeling useless. Okay, so data quality and uncertainty must be tracked and communicated for sure, but it's better to provide a formal treatment of uncertainty to reduce bias. So oftentimes, I think we see qualitative and rather normative efforts to deal with uncertainty. And those kind of qualitative approaches leave more room for bias, I would argue. In contrast, the models are explicit, transparent, and repeatable tools, and the model should be built to meet the decision context. So the SSA informs the recovery plan. Right, so it's the roadmap for recovery. It's also not a regulatory document. It provides guidance, and it includes the recovery implementation strategy, the when, how, and with whom recovery actions will be implemented. So the recovery criteria based on the 3 Rs and incorporate recovery actions, those that remove and manage threats, and you estimate the time and cost of implementation. So I wanted to go through a case study species, and I selected the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse, largely because it's so cute. No, but seriously, because it has a recent species status assessment available and a recent recovery plan. And there's a lot of uncertainty about this species. So it was listed as endangered in 2014. Habitat loss and fragmentation are severe for the species. And climate change is causing more severe flooding and wildfires that's destroying habitat. So the mouse is located in just 13 Huckahee watersheds, organized as 6 geographic units. So they are recognized by New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, but those designations prevent take but don't protect habitat. And so another reason why I chose the species is because, as far as I know, there are no banks or crediting programs available for the species. And so I thought I'd offer ideas without hopefully not stepping on toes. So data from the species status assessment, incredibly helpful, describing the dense riparian herbaceous vegetation required by the species. The species hibernates 8 to 9 months a year. It's active during the warm growing season for grasses and forbs and feeds on insects and seeds from grasses and forbs. It's hard to trap, and so there's not a lot of data on the species. And so when data were lacking, the SSA used information from closely related species. The mouse demonstrates high sight fidelity. Daily maximum distance moved only about 600 feet. The maximum dispersal distance per year is about 3,300 feet. The movements tend to be seen to be associated with foraging habitat, areas with herbaceous vegetation and saturated soils. And male and female home ranges are around 0.6 and 0.45 acres respectively. And during nesting, they do go up into the floodplain, into higher elevations, and into the more woody debris when they rear their young. So these populations were historically interconnected. And so isolation has caused genetic differentiation among existing populations. So the conservation plan should incorporate plans for connectivity, and suitable habitat should be less than 1 kilometer away. So the recovery strategy for the jumping mouse, this is the 6 geographic units across New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona here. And the goals are to protect existing populations within each geographic unit, to ensure genetic and ecological diversity, to restore and expand riparian habitat, to reduce stressors causing cumulative habitat loss and fragmentation, and to replicate populations within each geographic unit to increase redundancy. So the estimated cost of delisting for the species is $49.5 million. So how can we get markets to interact with these recovery goals? Can we track species crediting contributions towards recovery? And certainly, I think we can. And in fact, because past policies calls for a net gain, how can we track the contribution towards net gain towards recovery? And in my work, I've always related tradable credits towards recovery levels at a landscape scale, using the landscape equivalence analysis approach, which is just the proportional difference in population trajectories over time, given different landscape scenarios or trades. And I'd be happy to talk more about that later. I've presented on that in the past. So again, integrating markets and recovery goals, reducing uncertainty is an important part of recovery. And reducing a scientific uncertainty is a critical part of site scale management for crediting in these conservation banks, right? But credits are decided early and typically are not revised for the life of the bank. And so sometimes I wonder if maybe we should start thinking about grandfathering credits. And I think immediately this would be unpopular because a banker wants to know how many credits they have as soon as possible. However, if we're dealing with a situation with a species with a lot of uncertainty, and we're trying to get a market started, maybe allowing a bank to have a certain number of credits for a certain time, but then updating those credits once more data are collected could be advisable if it helps to increase investment in these credit programs. So in terms of the New Mexico Meadow jumping mouse, there's a lot of shared uncertainty. There'd be, if a credit market were developed, there would be a lot of shared uncertainty between recovery and the credit market. So in terms of how habitat structure affects survival and fecundity, about how landscape structure affects dispersal and genetic diversity, and about environmental stochasticity and climate change and how it affects demography. And note that all this uncertainty exists in a case in which land use patterns are also changing as well. So what I'd propose to do, I've been working on this problem for quite some time, and what I propose to do is develop a mitigation information hierarchy to develop software to help manage the information choices during mitigation. And I submitted proposals to the National Science Foundation Small Business Innovative Research Program in 2019 through 2021. Yeah, so I submitted it 3 times. I just couldn't get the idea to fit within that program. I'd be happy to talk to you guys more about that idea and that proposal. I'd even be happy to share the reviewer comments. You know, some of them are kind of entertaining. But anyway, the idea is to determine what data or information tools are best able to capture and reduce critical uncertainty. You know, models differ so much in complexity and their treatment of uncertainty. And so we need to figure out, when does adding more data and model complexity help us reduce critical uncertainty to improve market outcomes. So species status assessments often include demographic models, as we'd already highlighted. So some even include the spatial dynamics of subdivided populations. So the New Mexico Meadow jumping mouse SSA provides a good set of parameters that someone could use to start building a matrix population model, and you could work with advice from experts and data from closely related species to fill in the gaps. And so such a model would then provide a testable hypothesis for estimating credits, and then provide an opportunity for reducing uncertainty, to confront that model with data over time and reduce uncertainty. If we were to use just a GIS-based habitat model, that would ignore many critical uncertainties about the interaction between recruitment and dispersal under climate change, because there are a lot of temporal spatial interactions happening. So this is my first draft for spatially structured populations for the information hierarchy. So the information hierarchy here, it increases in biological complexity as we go down. And so in my group, we've always started with building habitat models, right? So currently, the most common thing to do is build a habitat model and develop credits based on some geometric summaries of habitat. And there are a large number of ways to do that. And then you can also use Maxent, which is a presence-only occupancy model, which has had good success in many cases. So in both of these cases, you're describing or estimating habitat occupancy at one point in time, right? So they make a variety of equilibrium assumptions. In contrast, though, where things get a bit more complex, you're estimating how population parameters are affected by landscape change and climate change. You can use patch occupancy models, group-based models such as matrix population models, and agent-based models. And to the best of my knowledge, I recently checked the literature again a couple of months ago that agent-based models are the only model that's been shown to be able to predict habitat occupancy for at-risk species in non-equilibrium conditions. I did find a paper recently that showed validation of Maxent predicting occupancy for invasive species, and that was interesting. But invasive species tend to have high reproductive rates and a strong ability to disperse. And so they're able to basically approximate those equilibrium assumptions. So these are some critical things to consider when you're applying models to management decisions. Okay, so how would we make decisions within the information hierarchy given this complexity. I just want to start by thinking about a really complex situation in which you have a population in which recruitment oftentimes determines the number of dispersers are out across the landscape. But in some cases, recruitment is limited by dispersers coming into a population unit, and they're affected by fragmentation, which is changing over time. So that's kind of a vicious cycle. And that's the impact of habitat fragmentation on population viability, is that you can't get dispersers back in to add to more recruits, and then you're not creating more dispersers, and you get an extinction vortex going. And then at the same time, you can have climate change affecting both recruitment and dispersal. So the spatial temporal interactions here are fairly complex. Or you can think about a case in which recruitment is not dependent on dispersal. Maybe you've got an insect with a high reproductive capacity, producing a large number of recruits across the landscape, but that insect's recruitment could be affected by climate change. So this is a more simple situation, and you would likely be able to work with a more simple model, right? But assuming that this simple situation applies to all species, though, I would argue is pretty problematic. Or you can think of a circumstance in which climate change is not affecting dispersal or recruitment, but habitat fragmentation is an issue. All right, so how do we know complexity for crediting is correct? Trades in that case, if we had the right complexity, trades would not have a negative consequence on recovery at a landscape scale. And trades would not increase the probability of local extinction or inbreeding in nearby habitats. And we'd have the right complexity if the information costs are sufficiently offset by market benefits. And so I've done this in the past by applying machine learning to decision analysis to determine when increased complexity is cost effective or not. So it provides an optimal stopping rule for collecting data. So we can get at these questions by applying different models to contrast information content. So here's an example where I applied an agent-based model, a very complex model for the record-cated woodpecker, to a fragmented landscape here in blue. We have each blue dot is a breeding group, and it's highly fragmented. And the nice thing about the record-cated woodpecker is that they're spatially fairly discrete. And then we imagine adding a bank to the middle. And then I simulated a trade within the landscape. And basically, I tested the recommended mitigation ratio that was incorporated in the recovery plan, in the old recovery plan. So the taking that I did was a 1-to-1 ratio for habitat area and connectivity, meeting the recovery plan goals. So I tested the efficacy of that by using the agent-based model. And then what I did is I went in and looked at the patches and looked at the change in the probability of occupancy within each patch before and after the trade. All right, so the bank is demonstrating very durable responses that trading did not affect the occupancy much within the bank. However, the patches outside of the bank, we see that for about 30% of the patches outside of the bank, out here in the landscape, we're seeing a 50% decrease in the probability of occupancy for about 30% of the patches. And for about 10% of the patches, we're seeing roughly a 70% decrease in the probability of occupancy. So when you're trading habitat, you have to recognize that you're never just affecting one habitat patch in these spatially dependent populations. And so we can also ask, how much money are you leaving on the table because of uncertainty? So we can use multiple models. We can collect different hypotheses about how trading will affect the population. And then across those multiple models, we can ask, what's the greatest number of credits if the best trade could be made under each model? And we can also ask, what's the average number of credits across all models? And so this is decision analysis. And so the difference between those two values is the expected value of perfect information. So if we know enough about the species and there's not a lot of uncertainty, that expected value perfect information from the trade would be zero. However, if expected value perfect information is greater than zero, you can multiply that times the value of the credit, and that's your cost-effective level investment in future data collection and modeling. So just a note here on financial assurances. I reached out to some folks in the industry and talked about financial assurances. And really, you know, as you guys know, there isn't insurance being applied to contribution banks at this point, but there is an endowment that is set for long-term maintenance, and it's funded along with credit sales. And the question here is, you know, if we do embrace uncertainty, could that decrease the cost of long-term management? Or could it increase the cost of long-term management? All right, so if we actually embrace the uncertainty about climate change and look at multiple models, you know, it might give us increased confidence or not. But I think it's worthwhile to begin asking this question. All right, so closing thoughts, and hopefully we'll get to some questions. So I just want you to think about, you know, perhaps embracing uncertainty could create more opportunities for species markets. Could help us demonstrate contributions to recovery, though there will be uncertainty about that. And we could demonstrate reductions in uncertainty over time if we have models that can use data to reduce uncertainty. And I'm concerned about the attempts to ignore uncertainty. I don't think it's good for species, and I don't think it's good for adjacent landowners. You know, and also I think I've seen this a bit already that, you know, a nonprofit or state agency creates a crediting system, and they determine what uncertainty matters and what uncertainty doesn't matter. And so that creates market power of who determines what uncertainty matters. So your mitigation project might address uncertainties that others ignore, and you might not be able to trade on that value. Okay, so that's what I have today. And thanks so much for logging on. Hopefully you get some questions, and we've got a couple in the chat box here. I would also invite you to unmute yourself if you have questions. So Ted Weber, oh, I think Ted is with Defenders Wildlife. So with reference to the study I highlighted, that they found similar results for endangered animals and plants.
Yeah, there were follow-up studies.
Yeah, okay, follow-up studies. Thanks, Ted. And then Ted's other question is, a good idea for climate resilience would be to protect, appropriately manage, and restore aquatic and terrestrial climate refugia and corridors. Yeah, so Ted's just highlighting the importance there of having that landscape scale perspective when doing the planning. Would you like to add more to that, Ted?
No, those were just earlier in your talk, so they aren't completely relevant to the main substance of the talk. Okay, there are general thoughts.
Yeah, helpful comments. Thank you, Ted. Anybody have a comment or a question? If you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do so. Oh, so all right. Julie, I think you are unmuted. Okay, so Julie's question, I was wondering if you can give examples of grandfathering credits. Yeah, sure. So the idea there is that you assign credits to a bank, and then those credits are set and available for trading. And then the bank has further credits it can provide, but you wait to determine what those credit values are until uncertainty is decreased about landscape values, for example. So grandfathering credits is saying, you know, these are the credits we're recognizing initially right now, but we're going to learn in the future. But those old credits are still good, even though there's uncertainty that we didn't recognize initially. So you're grandfathering in their value. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so a quiet group today. Thank you so much for logging on. I look forward to seeing most of you in Boise, and would invite you to stop by Wednesday at the facilitated discussion to talk more about barriers and opportunities in species credits. Any other questions? Going once,
Yeah,
going twice.
it's a really interesting talk. Thanks for giving it.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Ted, and maybe I'll see you in Boise. And all right, guys. Well, have a good Friday, and thank you so much for logging on.
Bye.
Thanks, Doug. Great talk.
All right, thanks, guys.